say that there were already a few questions.
Yeah, but they're gone now.
One of them was why nude?
Yeah, it's a good question. Oh,
Cool.
we're live. Now it works. Well, hopefully the people that were there managed to find us.
Good.
Yep. But they haven't yet. Okay. Welp. Welcome. Nobody? Sorry, we had a couple problems. Our first stream died. It hit an error and it stopped working. We had to create another one. So hopefully you guys can find us. Oh, thought maybe someone messaged me and told us our stream died, but that was not the case. It was junk mail. So we're doing critiques this week. We've got 3 of them kind of lined up and ready to go because that's about how many I can do in one live stream. And this is one of them. But while we wait for some people to show up, I will first talk about something I filmed just before starting this live stream, which is this. I'm teaching a class right now about like head tilts, kind of like up and down tilts. And this is the week 1 demo, which I just shot right before this live stream. And we're kind of talking about how head tilts work, right? And kind of relating it back to a box and understanding the perspective of a box and how we're kind of like looking up at the box and how it tilts back. She specifically had both her head tilted back and tilted to the side a little bit, which made it kind of like extra difficult. And yeah, it was an interesting pose, interesting demo. So if you're in this class, it's a little bit late, but it'll be posted as soon as this live stream's over. I just have to upload it, which will take like an hour maybe, and then it'll be available. But this was the week one demo for my head tilt class. And then I also have the week 1 demo as a preview for my foreshortening class, which looks like this. And, you know, foreshortening is basically just the illusion of depth in a drawing is really what it is. People always think of it as things coming like directly at you. And that's true. Those are foreshortened things. But really, foreshortening is just the idea of things being shorter to create an illusion of depth. And that exists in literally every drawing that has any depth to it at all. So if you're doing any sort of like representational type drawing, of people, buildings, landscapes, there's going to be foreshortening in it, even if it's not obvious. And that's something we kind of talk about in the class. And then also the type of foreshortening that people think of is something we talk about the most, which is more like extreme foreshortening. You know, where things are just boom, like coming right at you. That is absolutely foreshortening, but you know, so is this arm, right? Where it's coming towards us, but it's not like super extreme. And if a person is literally standing straight up and down and nothing's coming towards the camera, there's still foreshortening because they have depth. I mean, there's like a thickness to them. And yeah, it's not like that extreme, but it's there, you know? And if you look up the definition of foreshortening, it's really just comes down to the illusion of depth in a drawing is really it. And perspective is really what it comes down to, and kind of understanding perspective and basic shapes and how to move them around and kind of create different things. Let's see. I was waiting for some people to show up. Our first live stream, now that there's some people here, the first one we did, I messed up. I don't know what button I hit, but it got a weird error, and I had to create another one real quick. So that's what happened. If you're in that first one and it died, and you're wondering what happened, that's it. I clicked the wrong thing. Yeah, in the meantime, while people find us again, I was just showing a couple things I filmed beforehand over the last couple days. And then, of course, I've also got, you know, last week's live stream. I've also got the week before that. And, week 5 demo from my figure drawing class. Week 5 demo from my head drawing class. Sorry, I'm just showing some stuff while we wait for more people to show up. But we can't wait forever, so I'm going to go ahead and start because this thing can't go on all day. Another question. Gabriel, welcome. Alfonso, you made it too. Welcome back. RF. Oh, and a question. What is the main purpose of drawing nude figures? Is it to study anatomy? Is it impossible? Oh, it is impossible to find nude art model drawing classes in my country. Can you draw clothed people as its substitute? Yeah, I mean, you don't have to draw nude figures. Mostly it's just like kind of the way that, you know, like since Renaissance times, that's kind of the way that drawing has been learned, is through drawing nude figures. And what's important about it is when you're drawing clothing, all the clothing wraps around the figure, right? So you need to be able to kind of understand what the figure is doing first and then kind of design the clothing to wrap around it. But you don't have to draw nude people to figure that out. You do need to draw people, but you don't necessarily need nude models. I mean, even if they're just wearing a bathing suit, that's fine. You could just practice drawing. You can look at clothed people and just practice drawing like, essentially like this, right? People that are made out of like cylinders and boxes and that kind of thing, just to get the proportions and figure out how things kind of orient in space properly. But you don't necessarily need a nude model. I mean, is it helpful? Maybe. I mean, that's the way that I learned to draw. So of course I'm going to think it's helpful. But you don't have to do it that way. I think there's a lot of people that learn to draw without nude models, and I think they get pretty good. It all just depends on what you practice and what your goals are, I guess. You know, I'm trying to think if there's a good alternative. I'm sure there's all sorts of like, probably computer models you could get, like 3D models that are just basically just plain, you know, not really naked people so much as just plain models. You know, they wouldn't be clothed, but it would almost be like a doll. You know, you could probably get something like that. That would work pretty well. It's really just about understanding the proportions and understanding how basic shapes relate to the body. But you don't need to, like if you plan on drawing clothed people, you know, you don't have to know all the anatomy really well. Like part of the reason we train drawing nude figures is because at least in the US and like Europe and stuff, like a lot of the comic book industry, the illustration industry, book covers, I don't know, it's all like entertainment industry. It's all like superheroes and like a bunch of like ripped people that are technically wearing clothes, but they're drawn essentially as nude figures. And then they just wrap little lines around them and add little like costume things. So you're basically drawing a nude figure and then adding a couple little things to it. And then that's like a superhero drawing, you know, like Superman is basically a nude figure with a cape and some underwear, you know, and like an S on his chest. But if you can't draw a nude figure well, you're gonna have a really hard time drawing Superman. But if you're in a situation where you're not interested in doing that, then there's no reason you have to study this stuff necessarily. Let's see. Alfonso, welcome. Okay, so I don't know. I was just showing off some stuff because our first live stream died. So I was just sitting here randomly showing some stuff while people can join. And but I've run out of stuff to show. Actually, I haven't. There's a whole pad full of stuff here, but I've run out of time. So we're going to get started on the critiques. First critique is the one that you see on the screen. I edited or censored, I guess I should say, the drawing as well, because I'm not entirely sure what the rules are on YouTube when it comes to this type of stuff. But this is a pretty cool drawing. I also have the drawing here on my computer, and my printer, unfortunately, doesn't work real well, which is weird because I bought what was supposed to be a pretty good printer. But I don't know, it just doesn't get the values right. It prints everything way too light. So, you know, I can see the original drawing that was sent to me on my computer, So for me, I can see all the original values. For you guys watching at home, not so much. You know, this is going to seem lighter than it actually is. But for critique purposes, you know, if this was a class, it would be fine because I'm kind of judging all of this off what I see on the computer. So first off, it's an awesome drawing. Cool pose. I mean, it represents the pose really well, and it has like a nice feel to it. Nice flow. I like the, you know, the legs crossing seem pretty good. It kind of feels like we're looking up at her a bit because in the photo, if you look, we're like really looking up at her. The camera's like kind of down by the ground looking up at her. So her feet and legs feel really big and her head and shoulders are kind of small. What's awkward about this is just the fact that the chair is cutting off most of her like hips and like the bottom half of her torso and butt. And so that makes it a pretty awkward pose, unfortunately. Aside from that, everything about it is really cool. If I were taking this photo, I would have put a different chair up there real quick because this is not a good angle for this photo or for this chair, you know? Because essentially what we have is like a torso and legs, but they feel disconnected. Like they feel like they could be two totally different things, you know? And the reason for that is because of the awkward placement of the chair. So the first thing I would say is be really careful. Like, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have drawn this, right? I think this was Rio's drawing, if I remember correctly. I don't know if you're watching or not, but if you are, first I would say that as a study, as practice, this would be good to draw because it's got some cool stuff about it. But also try to recognize that in any other situation, this would be pretty awkward just because we're totally missing the part of her that connects her legs and her torso, you know, so it has kind of an awkward look to it. And then it's got this look where we have just like a little bit of the fingers sticking out right here. And so we have like all the legs going here, the torso coming here, and they're leading us right into this spot where these little fingers pop out. And it just looks kind of odd. It looks a little funny to me. But it looks that way in the reference. I mean, I'm not critiquing your drawing. I'm just critiquing the photo at this point. You know, so you have to be really careful when you select your reference, you know. And again, like as just practice, I think this is fine to draw, you know. But if you were doing like shooting reference for an illustration or like, I don't know, anything, a job, I would recommend using like a different type of chair or something. So the way the critiques work at the school is essentially I print out the student drawing, which is here. And then I've got a couple more here as well that we'll try and get through. I've got another like head drawing, and this one I think is Alfonso's maybe. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But this was something that someone drew from last week's live stream while they were watching the live stream, and then they turned it in to be critiqued, and we will talk about it. And then this one as well, which I think is Liv's maybe. But we're going to start with Rio's. Also, I'm going to open my Coca-Cola and drink it because it's delicious. Both delicious and gives me energy for drawing. Okay, so we kind of critiqued the photo a little bit, which is a little bit awkward. As a drawing, though, it was pretty good. Right? What I'm seeing here is that the leg, I like the top half. I feel like the top half works pretty well. The head is a little bit odd. I think the face is too small. Or maybe the head is too small, or it could just be the perspective that's a little bit off. Like I feel like almost you're kind of taking her face and turning it towards us a little bit more than I'm seeing in the reference, and it doesn't feel like we're looking up at her quite as much. And then it's also, yeah, that would be about it. But again, I don't want to be too hard on it because as a drawing, it works pretty well. You know, the hair could use a little bit work. I'd watch, like you have kind of these like random dark shapes in here, which is okay. I get what you're going for. It's that curly hair, which is so hard to draw. I kind of avoid it typically because it just, there's no like easy way to draw it. It's very time consuming to draw very curly hair like this, but we'll see if we can come up with something that maybe helps. Yeah, just taking a second to just look at the reference, look at the drawing, and try and assess what's going on here. Part of it, I'm looking at the negative shape. So we have a negative shape here between the arm and the leg and the bottom of the breast and rib cage. And it feels much longer than it does in the reference. So we'll need to figure out why that is exactly. And I feel like you've also taken her torso here and made it a little bit thinner and maybe even pushed it back a little bit farther. You know, when I look at the reference, this point here sits directly underneath her chin, maybe to the left of her chin. So if her chin is here, right, and we drew a line straight down from there, that kind of tells me that this point isn't, like what's going on down here isn't aligning with the head quite right, which in itself isn't necessarily bad, right? Like changing the reference a little bit isn't bad as long as it's done on purpose and for a reason. And this kind of doesn't feel, I don't know, it feels more like something's being pulled apart and not working quite right. We also need to maybe delineate this shoulder a little bit better. You know, let me look at it on the computer here. Yeah, so this is a tough angle for like the shoulders and rib cage because we're looking up at her. So what's going to happen is something kind of like this, right? So let's go in here, we'll find a good head shape, and we're looking up at her. So I'm going to kind of tilt my cranial mass back a little bit. Right, for starting my head construction, and then we kind of have the side plane of the head coming down this way. Right, this part kind of sweeps down. A little bit like this. And then the chin is like kind of here. Kind of like that, like we're seeing up into the underplane of the jaw a little bit. You know, so we'll kind of create our head shape and then see if we can kind of attach the neck. I'm going to kind of swing down this direction and down this direction. Right, hard to tell, her hair is covering her ear. Well, you can see a little bit of it. You gotta zoom in there, but it's basically sitting back here. Right, and then a little bit of that underplane of the jaw. And then her neck coming down this way. Right, now the center line looks relatively straight up and down, which makes sense. She doesn't have her head tilted back. It's just that we're looking up at her a lot. Right, so we'll have maybe our center line here. And then her hairline is going to be like way up here at the top because we're looking up at her. You know, pick up a little bit of like sideburn right up in there. And to be honest, I'm taking this too far. We don't need to draw this much of the head yet because we might need to change it. And that's one of the things we need to be really careful with, is not drawing too much at one time, because we do need the ability to go in and change things as needed. And if you draw too much, then you're going to have a tendency to not want to change things. You know, if I sat here and worked on this head for like, 5 or 10 minutes and brought it up to like a nice little head, and say I got it looking really good and I was like, yeah, this is awesome, and then I went and drew everything else and then realized like, oh my gosh, the head's too big or too small, my tendency would probably be to not want to change it because I worked so hard on it, which is why we want to bring everything up together, kind of. Okay, so we need the angle of the shoulders. Right now, the angle of the shoulders is roughly about like this, which is pretty close, pretty good. What's tough here is we're seeing the collarbone in a way where it's like kind of rounded this direction, which is a little bit awkward, but it happens because we're looking up at it. And then we get the shoulder kind of popping up out over here. Have our shoulder, and the pec kind of going up this direction. A little bit of like the acromion process or something maybe showing. And then the other shoulder now. So here we're getting like collarbone and maybe a little bit of like pectoralis coming down this way. And then that other shoulder is dropping out over here and just kind of popping out from behind all this stuff. Kind of sitting right back in there, right? So we're kind of starting with that head, neck, shoulder section, right? The pit of the neck is like right down in here a little bit. We're looking up at it, so it's not that obvious. It's very shallow when you look up at it like that. Right, and now our center line, and here's where things are going to start to change, right? So far, the head size is about the same, the shoulder is about the same. I've designed it a little bit more, especially up in this area. I was, much more careful with that shoulder. But generally speaking, proportionally, everything's about the same. But our center line now, again, if I use a plumb line, the belly button sits kind of underneath her ear right here. Right, so we're gonna have to shift that part forward. So we have the center line kind of wrapping around the rib cage, kind of back this way. Right, kind of doing that. And we're gonna have this arm back this direction. All right, double check the angle of the arm. Seems pretty good. Maybe I angled it too much. Leave it about there. Pretty much right where you had it. And so we'll kind of do a quick gesture for the torso, right? So her rib cage is sitting in here. And then we have kind of the, like maybe some of the lat coming in here, and then the oblique coming back that way. The abs are going to kind of continue down around this direction. And then we get some compression, and then they kind of pop back out. Kind of right down around there. Right, so now we need to add, or at least kind of figure out where the breasts are going to sit. And they're essentially around this level and at around the same angle as the shoulders. As a general rule, that's a good place to start when you're kind of judging the angle of the breasts, because they kind of move along with the shoulders. If you move one shoulder up, it pulls the pectoralis up, which pulls the breast up, you know, and so they tend to be similar. They're usually not exactly the same as the shoulders, but they're similar. You know, and just in terms of measuring, that's kind of a good place to start. Get this other arm on here. Right, just sticking with gesture. We're sticking with C curves, S curves, and straights. Nothing more, right? Those are the only marks that I'm making here. And then occasionally I draw circles and ovals, but I kind of consider those to be C curves, personally, because they're essentially just elongated C curves that wrap back around on themselves. It's kind of the way I think of ovals. So we get pectoralis here, and then the breast coming out this direction and wrapping back behind the rib cage. Back behind there. You know, rhythmically we could connect them together. Find a nice rhythmical relationship. I also have the pec kind of coming in this direction. You know, kind of leaving connection in there. Breast, then this one is going to kind of drop around this way and connect over here. It's a good idea to try to include a straight when you're designing the breasts, like a straight line, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive because they're round forms. But we also want to make sure that they're affected by gravity and they don't just look like they're floating. And a good way to do that is to try and figure out where you can include a straight line, like right here, because that kind of implies that gravity's like pulling on it, you know. And then like this one, I don't know, we probably don't need to push a straight here, but pushing one here is good. We could maybe push one on this side a little bit, but I think this is pretty good the way it is. Right, and so from here now we need to figure out kind of where this arm is going to sit. You know, it's kind of coming out this direction from under the shoulder. And then kind of wrapping, like gesturally kind of doing this. Which again is right where your arm is, right? I mean, they're basically in the same spot. What I'm going to do, I think, is pull this knee back a little bit. I think that's really what's causing the negative shape here to not look quite right. And we need a thicker arm, right? So the other thing I'm seeing is this arm needs to be a little bit wider. And kind of connect right about here. You know, and then our elbow, or not our elbow, well, yeah, the elbow is going to hit kind of right where this leg is. And I think we can adjust the angle of the leg as well. I think it's a little bit flat, maybe. Just a little bit. I think that's what's going to help change this negative shape here. Is changing the angle of this leg. So it comes down more like that way. Yeah, see, I'm not going to say this is perfect, but this negative shape to me it's starting to feel more like the one in the reference. Again, it's not exact. It's not like it has to be like 100% exact, but it's close. Close enough. So this is going to come out, wrap kind of out around this way, and then we get this point where the arm is kind of pressed up against the knee. And what's interesting is your knee, earlier I said your knee kind of needed to move, but it only needs to move a little bit, I think, not a lot. I think it was pretty close. It was more the angle of the leg that needed to change and the width of this arm, right? And then from there, we can kind of start looking for the gesture of the legs, right? So we'll have this knee about here, and then that's going to pull, or not pull, but like connect down into this leg here. I'm just going to look for a nice sweep across the leg. And from there down into the foot. The feet are pretty big, but I think this might be a little bit too big. And then also watch the width here. This feels a little too wide to me between the outside of the leg here and the calf. So let's see. So this is going to come out to the foot. And kind of find the gesture for this leg. And I feel like this heel is too tall, all right? So we're going to kind of pull that in a little bit. It feels like a better foot size. I mean, it's big compared to the head, but that's kind of what we want because the camera is down low looking up at her. So these legs are going to be a little bit big to begin with. The other leg, this is tough, right? So this section right in here is really difficult because it's creating a tangent. And if you zoom in and look, it doesn't quite create a tangent, but it's really close. And we need to make sure to not have that happen. So a tangent essentially is anytime three lines like kind of converge at the same spot, like if they do that, right, that would be a tangent. We want to avoid that in our drawings as much as possible. And I think in math, like in a graph, a tangent is actually when two graphs meet, like that would be the tangent. But in drawing, it's either this, I mean, it's also that, but also for some reason, whenever three lines meet like that, they also call it a tangent. I think because artists probably don't know math real well. Not that I do. In fact, I'm not even sure why I know that. That might be wrong. But a tangent is when a bunch of lines all kind of come together like that. We want to avoid it, right? And that's kind of happening right here in this area, right? So we want to make sure that this leg is going to cross this stuff in a way that avoids that. Right, so it's cutting across here, right, kind of like that. We have this leg coming back behind this one, and then this part of the abs disappearing back here. And what we're doing is we're kind of separating this stuff out, right? So it's not all kind of like meeting at the same point. You did the same thing, to be honest. You also avoided that problem. So I'm not trying to say you did it wrong. I'm just kind of pointing out that it's a tough area, right? And it would be really easy to let those things all meet at the same point. And I would advise against that as much as possible. So we're getting compression up in here, where we're getting the leg compressed up against this leg, and we're seeing some of the calf kind of pressed up into here. Lower that a little bit more. And this, as you can see, is another area where we're starting to get like a tangent type situation. So we're going to have to be really careful here how we design this. Calf comes out, back, and so it's about like that. And then we need to make sure that even though it kind of looks this way in the reference, that this other leg is kind of coming from a different direction. Not a different direction, but not coming directly from this point. It needs to be like shifted a little bit. Again, to avoid that little tangent right in there. And what that really does is it just creates way more depth, right? Because depth comes from, well, it comes from a number of things, but one of the things it comes from is overlap, right? And the way lines overlap each other, right? So this line overlaps these two lines, which tells us that it's, something is in front of them. Same thing with this. And when you end up with a tangent type situation like that, it makes it difficult to tell what's in front of what, and so then we have to go in and either clarify it or, change it up to make it work properly. Let's see if we can get some of this chair on here, but it's really awkward. Get a good angle for the chair. That seems about right. Basically coming this way. So I'm going to look for the gesture for this leg. Just kind of coming out this way. And then we have the back foot here, which is kind of merging with this one in a way that's a little bit awkward. Also, this foot, I think, is still a little bit too big. Right, and we're seeing that other foot kind of stick out back here. Pop out back this way, and then we get the heel back up in here. Right, so we get that foot back there, and then it's kind of connecting. Let's see, we get this calf. We're seeing up into the underplane of the leg up in here. So we need to kind of capture a little bit of that, a little bit of the hamstring as well, some of the tendon. So I think that's looking pretty good, right? The other thing is this arm, right? And this is a really challenging arm. When we get into those like kind of foreshortened forearms, they can be really tough. So the first thing I would look for is where the wrist is going to go. And you actually drew a pretty good arm. Mostly I would say it's just too thin up here And then we can kind of work on this wrist a little bit maybe. And so there's not a lot of negative space, right? Like it comes right up from this knee. And then the hand is kind of like right back here, right? So I think we can take the hand and pull it back a little bit. You know, and then our wrist is kind of like up this way. Oh, Constantinus, I'll read your question in a second. I want to work on this hand first. But I'm just going to get a quick, like, kind of shape on here for the hand. I don't want to spend too much time on the hand because hands take a long time. I've never been the fastest at drawing hands. They always take a little while. But I'm just going to get just kind of a general shape on here first. Something like that, maybe. Something that that proportionally fits kind of what we need, and then we can go back in and make it into whatever we need it to be later, essentially. Because right now, I kind of want to talk more about what's going on with the foreshortening in this arm, right? So our elbow's like way back here, right? So if we're going to think about this as basic shapes, what's happening is we're getting kind of like a cylindrical form. Kind of back up in here coming towards us. Right, a little bit like that. And then we have the forearm coming towards us like even more, really. Kind of doing this. This, and we're getting some bone from the wrist popping out this way. Right, and kind of heading back towards our elbow. The elbow is like kind of back up in here a little bit. Right, so notice I'm really kind of trying to think of this as like a cylinder, right? If this was a cylinder coming towards me, how would that look? And then also realizing that, okay, well, our wrist then is actually kind of like a boxy type shape. You know, kind of sitting up in there. You know, and then we just kind of layer some muscles back on, especially because we're getting compression from her knee. So we're kind of seeing compression occurring like kind of in here where it's getting pressed up. You know, and then we get some of the bicep out here. It's a little too extreme. Took it too far. Oh, God. Whoops. Keep that pretty flat. I think that works okay. Shrink that a little bit. The hand kind of like inserts into the wrist a little bit because the wrist bones are pretty round. You know, so we get this thing where like, you know, the wrist is like back here, but the wrist bones are kind of like this rounded shape. And then we get like kind of these little connection points in here and here. And then on top of that, we're seeing the wrist bone itself kind of pop out this way a little bit. You know, for the radius. And then the ulna is like on the pinky side of the wrist. So we get the ulna over here, radius like over on this side in terms of our forearm bones. I don't know, this arm ended up a little bit big, but I think you get the idea at least in terms of what we're going for here. You know, so then the next part would be to kind of figure out exactly what's going on with the shadows, right? Because in the reference, he put some shadows on there. I don't know. What time is it? I've been working on this for a long time. A little after 7. I don't have time to like render the whole thing, but what I will do is just one little section maybe real quick. Also add just the slightest bit of muscle sticking out right here. I think I could use that, and then it kind of pops out down here into our tarsals and then metatarsals. Oh, and also we get some forearm back here as well. And maybe some elbow? Not quite. But as far as like the shadows and stuff go, what I'm seeing is, and it's tough to see this on the printout, but I can see it on the computer because everything seems really light on the printout. But there's too much contrast in the shadows. So right now, when I look at the shadows on the leg, the reflected light in here is way too bright. It's almost like as bright as the color of the paper. You know, and that color of the paper should be our highlights. You know, unless you want to use like white colored pencil or something, which I don't think you are. So if that's our highlight color, that should only show up maybe like up in here a little bit and on the face, maybe like the front of the leg, but we can't have that in the shadows, right? We have to keep our light values and our shadow values separate. And there's just too much going on in here, right? We want to really simplify the shadows and then keep the detail in the light. You know, and in this case, it would probably be more in the torso because that's kind of, I don't know, it has a little bit more contrast to it. And this just feels a little less contrasty. It's just really bright. And so what we want to do is, I might do this on a separate page real quick. So we want to create a really strong shadow pattern, which you're doing. I mean, the pattern itself is decent, you know, but we need to make sure that it really reads clear. So we're going to have some shadow coming down here. A little bit of light right there. Right? And then we're picking up this part where the bone is kind of popping out. And then we're picking up more shadow kind of across here. We're going to keep the edges relatively soft here. It's a pretty round form, but it's also not a big form, so we don't want to be too soft. Right? And the shadow kind of continues up the arm. All right, kind of going up that way. I'm going to pull the knee guess that's fine. I was going to say I'm going to pull the knee down a little bit, but just kind of adjust that shape a little bit. Okay, so the reason I'm drawing the arm is because, you know, the shadow is being cast from the arm down onto the leg, so it wouldn't look quite right if we didn't include the arm. Right, so then we'll kind of come in here and say, okay, we have a cast shadow coming across the knee. So it's kind of coming up and over this way. And then it's being cast kind of down the leg. Kind of coming down here, coming down this way. Gets really soft in here. Right, so now we're thinking about edge. Right, shape, value, and edge is really what shadows and rendering are kind of all about. You know, and then it's going to kind of drop down this direction. And then it kind of pops back out. Across this way. And then our shadow here kind of cuts across this direction. So it gets pretty soft and turns into a form shadow running right across here. Right, so we're going to pick up a nice form shadow now, kind of coming this way. It's going to be nice and soft. Drops back down that direction. And then again, we're picking up a cast shadow now from the leg down onto this one. So that's going to be, again, kind of a hard edge. Kind of wrapping around that way. And then a little bit of a cast shadow, maybe coming back this way as well. And then into another form shadow on this leg, which is going to be really soft. Sorry, off screen a little bit. My apologies. Foot sits back there. The rest of this leg on here. Okay, so what we want to do is figure out how to fill all of this in a way that hopefully maintains the separation in our values between our shadow and our light values. Right, which means getting distracted here. Which which means we need to start out with it kind of all as one value pretty clearly, like create a really strong 2-value drawing, and then figure out how to I'm just going to end it right there. There's more shadows down there, but essentially we want this all to be one value, right? So we're going to come in here and create a nice strong 2-value. We want it to be kind of dark, you know, dark enough that it'll work as a shadow value, but light enough that it'll work as our reflected light, because that's really what this is going to end up being, is our reflected light value. Right, but notice I filled in the entire thing, even where the reflected light is. And so now we're not going to have these like bright spots in here, right? We want to avoid that because right now you have like a really bright spot right here and right up in here. And we can't have that, right? Even though it does look bright, it needs to be pretty dark. And the way that we're going to make that look bright is rather than like, you know, using our eraser and pulling stuff back out, we're going to start with a good shadow value, right? Something like this, and then we're going to make things darker around those areas, right? So what we're going to do is start to add darkness up under here, right? Because we have a little bit of an occlusion shadow up under here, right? So then we can kind of gradate away from that leg, right? And it kind of gets rid of that line and starts looking much more dimensional. Same thing around here a little bit, right? We also have an occlusion shadow, like up under this arm right here. And then we have a core shadow running kind of down the side of the leg here, right? And those are the things that are going to help create that reflected light look. So what we need to do is go darker in here and sort of gradate away from this line. Right, because it's getting really dark up under that arm. And then we're going to have a little bit darker kind of out around the calf here. But also very soft, right? I'm working really hard to maintain those edges that I established. Right, so it gets darker here, and then we get a core shadow kind of running down this way. Right, and then if you look, excuse me, you'll notice that there's the leg behind this one is much darker than this one, right? So we're going to have dark leg back behind here. And the effect, as you can see, is that we're left with that brighter reflected light showing through right in here. And we don't want too much detail in the shadows, even though when you look at the photo, you can see all kinds of detail in there, right? For sure. I mean, it's there, you know, but we don't want it in there necessarily. What we want is less detail in the shadows, more detail in the light. Okay, so we also have a little bit of a core shadow right up around here where it starts out kind of subtle, a little bit of a subtle core shadow, and it becomes a little bit darker back up in here, right? And that's starting to look a little bit more interesting. So you can see we've basically started with our shadow value and then built up tone around it to create that reflected light look, you know, and that kind of ensures that things don't get too bright, you know, because even though, like, there's this weird thing that happens where our eye works in a way that's actually pretty cool, right? So our eye, obviously the iris can open and close and let in more light or less light. And so when we look at something that's really dark, our eye opens up and lets more light in, right? So we can see more detail. You know, and if it's dark outside and we walk around, the iris opens up and we can see more stuff. If we're looking at something that's really bright, it does the opposite and it closes and lets less light in so we can get things focused properly. The problem with drawing is when we look at an area in the shadows on you know, either a real life model or in a photo, our eye kind of looks and says like, oh, this is dark, and it'll kind of let more light in and it'll let us see more information in the shadows. So there's kind of like this weird effect where if we kind of draw it the way we literally see it, it won't look real good as a drawing. It'll look like it has too much information in the shadows. And again, the reason for that is just because of how our eye works. You know, and so we need to recognize that and see if we can kind of compensate for it a little bit. And compensate by, you know, basically squinting helps. Squinting will kind of like counteract that. So if you look at the reference and you squint, so you're looking at it like kind of through your eyelashes almost, it'll simplify the values and make everything appear, I don't know, more of the way it actually is, I guess, without your eye focusing on different parts of it. It kind of lets you see it as a whole instead of just one little part at a time. And you'll notice when you do that, that the little reflected light parts in the shadow, like up in here, are actually much darker than they appear when you open your eyes up and look directly at them. You know, and so that's something that we just have to keep in mind and use to our advantage if we can. And just know that, you know, things typically are going to be a little bit darker in the shadows than we see them when we look right at them.
Can I do some questions, Brian?
Yeah.
Got a bunch of questions, but I just
Okay.
wanted to let you go for quite a while there.
It's cool. Appreciate that.
Let's see. There are so many.
Anyway, this is probably enough of this one. Are they asking about something I'm doing on here specifically? Because I was going to switch to another one because it's been a long time.
Yeah, this is a long critique.
Yeah, it's a long critique. They're usually more like 30 minutes long if you take a class, just so you know. They're usually like in the 20 to 40 minute range. I don't usually just ramble on for like an hour, although it has happened.
Really good though. Looks really cool. Let's see. There's a variety of questions.
Okay.
Let me ask you this one, Brickman. And
Brickman.
I see everyone's questions here, so I'll try to get to as many as I can. So Brickman asked a little while ago. He says, "Hi guys, one question. In the Watts figure drawing course, there's a large gap of information between phase 1 and 2. What do you think is the reason? Do you happen to know? Do you know what the things are like in the online program?"
I don't know the reason for that exactly. I do know that the reason that they kind of asked me to teach or to film some stuff for the online course was because that the stuff that they had was pretty advanced. Like it was supposed to be like kind of like beginning fundamental type stuff, but Jeff shot it all. And Jeff, amazing artist. I mean, I don't mean this in any way to say Jeff did a bad job or anything. In fact, he did too good of a job is really what it comes down to. And so the fundamental stuff that was in like the phase one, I don't remember exactly how the phases are broken down. It's been a long time. But like it was really kind of complicated, right? And so he was teaching like fundamental concepts, but like in an advanced way. And it was, you know, that's kind of tough for people that are just starting out. So he wanted me to go in and basically shoot my version of like some of the fundamental stuff. And so that's kind of why there's like two sets of fundamental things a little bit, because my way of teaching is very, very straightforward. It's very like I talk about what I'm doing and it's very logical. And you know, and Jeff is kind of the opposite, where he's usually talking a lot about like theory and spiritual stuff, and which is interesting. But when you're first trying to learn, it's, you know, it's a little confusing. You need like really clear, stick to the facts type information. And so they asked me to shoot kind of my version of the fundamental stuff. And so I don't know, maybe that's what you're talking about how there's like kind of like Jeff's version of the fundamentals and then kind of like my version of the fundamentals. If that's the gap, if not, then I don't really know, to be honest. I didn't really, I mean, I was at the school for a long time, but I personally didn't work through all the fundamental like online stuff. I did it all like in person classes. So I don't know. That's all I know.
Rickman just said thanks so much. So I think
Yeah.
that answered his question.
Good. Yeah.
And then RF is here as well and had a couple of questions.
Okay.
He said, or she, I don't know, RF, I'm guessing it's mostly guys here, I think. How does Jeff Watts draw accurately so fast without measuring? Have you ever tried to draw like him?
Jeff draws so fast because it's accurate in the sense that it looks really good as a drawing, but he's not copying the reference. And he's been doing this for so long and is so good at it that what he's doing essentially is figure invention. And he can invent figures really fast. And so when he draws from a model or a piece of reference, all he's looking at is what's the pose and what's the body type, the likeness, things like that. And then just inventing a figure that looks like that. You know, he's not really spending any time like analyzing and measuring and doing stuff like that, just because he's been doing it for so long. It is so intuitive and he's done it so many times that he's just crazy good at it, really, is what it comes down to. That's really the answer. And that's kind of what I, like the way that I teach and the way that I draw, like I'm in a weird situation where I kind of learned how to draw through teaching. And so over the years, I've kind of like changed up how I draw a little bit based on how people learn and what they need to learn and how I see people kind of use the information that I give them. And so what I've kind of like ended up with over the years is I teach in a way where it's fundamentals and it's reference based. And I teach how to analyze the reference and how to accurately copy it, but hopefully in a way that leads you to that point where you can actually draw without copying the reference, right? Because you need to make that leap between the two. Because any like top, like artists that you see do figure drawing or any type of drawing, illustration. You know, if you look at like a lot of top illustrators will shoot photo reference for their paintings and stuff, even fine art stuff, anything. Any top person that's working from reference isn't actually copying the reference. And that's like the big secret that people don't know, because they see them looking at a model or a piece of reference and then they see them drawing and it creates the impression that they're just like copying it, but they're not. They're actually inventing, and they've just gotten so good that they can like just kind of do their own thing with it essentially. And, you know, the way that I teach starts like that. And then immediately like the next step is to break it down into basic shapes, right? And so that's kind of the idea, is to start visualizing things as boxes and cylinders and three-dimensional forms. And if you can start figuring that out and how that relates to the reference and what you're seeing in the photos, that sets you up to be able to start doing actual figure invention, you know, and help bridge that gap between copying and just inventing something, you know. So forget what the question was. Oh, how Jeff draws so fast.
Yeah.
Because he's crazy good is the answer. But that's really it. Is he's done it so much that he can invent a figure really fast, and then he's just referencing a few specific things off the photos or off the model. So yeah, that's my answer.
There's another question here from the same person who I think this question kind of segues pretty well into what you were just talking about.
Okay.
But from the very beginning of the stream, RF asks, what is the main purpose of drawing nude figures? Is it to study anatomy?
I answered that one.
You answered this one.
I did. I actually leaned over it. I read a question early on.
Oh, good.
And I talked about it. I can talk about it again, though.
Oh, I don't know. Whatever.
But you don't have to draw nude people to get good at drawing. That's traditionally kind of the way it's been done since like Renaissance times. So that's just kind of the way it's done, at least like in European and the US and European countries, stuff like that. But you don't have to do it. You can draw clothed people. The reason you want to draw nude people is because you're essentially creating like if you ever see like 3D animation and they start with these like kind of like weird, they're not really naked, but they're just like plain figures essentially. And then they kind of like animate them. And then all the extra stuff gets layered on top of them. You're doing the same thing essentially. If you're drawing clothed people, you're draping clothes around specific forms. And understanding how those forms work is really helpful to figure out how clothing is going to work. And then on top of that, if you're drawing, at least in the US, I mean, most of our superheroes and things that you see in illustrations, book covers, they're basically naked people. I mean, that sounds weird, but like if you go look at any comic book or superhero nowadays, they're essentially nude people with underwear on and a belt and a cape, maybe a cape, depending on who it is. And then they just like kind of add like maybe like some bracelets or some things wrapped around their arms and legs. And then they just color their body a different color. And then it's just like a costume, but most comic books are basically just drawing nude people. So that's, I think, partly also why everybody's so, I don't know, always trying to figure out like anatomy and that kind of stuff. That's a big part of it. I'm not sure what I'm drawing now. I'm gonna stop.
Okay, there's 2 more questions for you.
Okay. I'm gonna start taping up the next one while you read them.
Okay, that sounds
Because
good.
I gotta do more stuff.
Cool. RF, I'm glad you had your question answered twice, maybe in 2 different ways. Let's see. So the other set of questions here is from Constantinus.
Constantinus, okay.
Or Constantinus.
Constantinus? Constantinus?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I went with the Roman sounding pronunciation. Let's see. So they say, hi Brian, a few questions. Are the O'Cor-Nor tin sets any good? And Co is like K-O-H.
Oh, Kohinoor. I think the I goes between Ko and Nor.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And then I'll ask you the second one after that. So if you want to answer that one first, do you know anything?
I don't know that much about them. I know they make good pens, and I've used their pens before, but I've never used like any, I don't know how to say it either, Kohinoor or something. I've never used like any pencils or charcoal of theirs, so I don't really know. The test, I don't know which kind of tin set you're talking about, because I know a bunch of companies sell like little sets that you can get. And if I just look up real quick, I'll see what pops up if I Google it. Kohinoor tin set. Let's see what pops up. Yeah, see, there's like a whole bunch of them. There's colored pencils. So I don't know specifically which one you're asking about. There's some that are graphite. Here's one that's charcoal, I think. Oh, the Gioconda. I have heard of those. I've heard that some of those are good. My guess, because I've heard of those Giocondas and I've heard that people use them and they can be good depending on which ones they are. What I'll tell you kind of what you need to look for though. You need a pencil that can give you a full okay, if you're drawing the way that I draw, right? And depending on where you are in the world, this may or may not be possible. But what I'm doing and the way that I kind of learned to train to draw is with smooth newsprint and with charcoal pencils. And that's what kind of lets us create, this kind of stuff here, like last week's live stream, this. This was all done with one pencil, right? One pencil that I can get a full range of value out of. And so the idea is that we want to be able to get a full range of value from one pencil purely through pressure sensitivity, and then be able to sharpen the pencil in a way that allows us to basically get a variety of line. We can get the thinnest lines, or we can use it on the side and get broad strokes and create really soft edges and stuff. And we want to get all of that out of one pencil. So if you bought one of those sets, one of those pencils will probably be able to do that. Some are going to be too hard, some are going to be too soft. One of them will probably be just right and essentially let you do this, right? Which is, I can get like really, really light values out of this, right? I mean, that's pretty light. And that's just pure pressure sensitivity. Or I can get really dark values out of this, right? And that's just all out of one pencil. This one specifically is a Wolf's Carbon 6B. The ones that they use at Watts are the ones they always recommend. If I have them here somewhere, were usually these, right? I stopped using them because they started falling apart, but it's a Conte something Pierre Noir. I don't know how to say this, but it's basically a Conte. The marking got rubbed off, but it says 1710 on the back here, and then it's a B. And those work really well. They do the same thing. They'll let you get your darkest dark and your lightest light all out of one pencil purely through pressure sensitivity. The problem with these is they started falling apart. Their quality control was terrible, and they got to the point where they weren't sharpenable, right? Like we need to sharpen them like this, where we have a bunch of charcoal exposed. And when you did that with these pencils, for some reason, they changed something they were doing, and they would just fall apart. They were all broken inside. And every single box of pencils I bought was like that for like a couple of years. And basically, some of them would work, and maybe like I'd buy a box of 12 or however many, and there might be like 4 or 5 good ones in it, maybe 4. And then the rest were just like trash. They were like unusable. So I got tired of wasting my money after a while and started looking for another pencil. And the second best one I came up with was this Wolf's Carbon pencil. And it's pretty good. The only problem with it is it's a lot thinner. You can see it's a lot, where'd that pencil go? Thinner. So you can't expose as much charcoal, and you can't like sharpen it as much, and it makes like thinner strokes when you use it on the side. So that's a little bit of an issue, right? That makes it more difficult to fill in big areas, and it makes it more difficult to do a couple things, but I kind of got used to it, and it works pretty well now. And so that's what you need to look for, right? If you want to do what we're doing. But the problem is that only works on smooth newsprint. And that's kind of the sticking point, because there's a lot of places in the world that don't have access to smooth newsprint, and they can't get it. I mean, I know we can get it in the US, and I think there's like European countries where they can get it. And almost everybody else that I've talked to says they can't get smooth newsprint. And if you can't get smooth newsprint, my recommendation would probably be to use graphite. Because you can do all of this with graphite, and you'll need a range of pencils. You can't do it all with one pencil with graphite. But you'd have to get like a range of pencils and work a little bit differently. But you'd be studying all the same stuff, all the same principles, all the same rules apply. It would just be different supplies. What's up?
Are you reading the second part of the question?
Am I reading it?
Or did you read it? Or are you answering it?
Oh, no, I don't know what it said.
Oh, okay. You just started
No, I was just rambling about stuff.
I was like, how did he see it from there? Okay, so the second part actually was about paper, which is why I thought maybe you were answering the second part of their question.
They
so
just got
part
lucky.
2 is what recommended paper type to free sketch with chalk or lead for cheap in bulk. That's actually what we were looking for at the art store the other day.
Yeah.
So we're experimenting experimenting too, actually.
I just taught a class that I titled Intro to Drawing, and I set it up so that all you needed was a few graphite pencils and just like basic computer printer paper. And let's see, I have some of the results over here, I think. Whoa. Right, so this was kind of from that class that I just taught, right? And there's nothing like special about this paper. It's literally just like computer paper. You know, so the paper you would put in your printer, honestly, I don't know like the weight and all that, but I know it's not drawing paper necessarily. It's just made for printer paper, because I figured that's what most people would have access to. And so in this class, I mean, I did some different mark making stuff. We basically walked them through, you know, here's some S curves, you know, different curves, different little exercises you can do. And we walked through, oh, it's upside down, a little bit of basic perspective, you know, and just kind of talked about this. But all of this works the same, whether you're working with like charcoal or graphite, your paper. I mean, what's important is the concepts and the fundamentals of how this stuff works, you know? And so we talked about perspective a little bit, got 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, you know, how cylinders work in perspective is kind of important to understand. So I talked about that a little bit, you know, and then just talked about, you know, practice drawing ovals and circles and ellipses. Critical. I mean, it's like a critical base skill that you have to have is drawing C curves, S curves, and straights, and circles and ellipses really, really well. You know, and then to be able to draw basic shapes, right? Like to be able to draw boxes and cylinders from any perspective. Like you need to be able to just rotate these in your head and move them around and draw them from any angle, right? And that was something we talked about quite a bit in this class, was the importance of basic shapes. Some people call them primitives. I know there's a lot of drawing videos that'll call them primitives, but it's the same thing. Primitives, basic shapes, whatever you want to call them, you got to get really good at them. You know, and then this, I think, is kind of what you're thinking of maybe. So you can see here, like the quality of the paper isn't the best. I mean, we're picking up a lot of graininess in here that's coming from the paper, but all those principles work the same, right? Like we're seeing we got a pretty full range of value. And I did that with these pencils, if I can grab them here. I basically had, let me see, I didn't use all of these. I had an HB, 2B, 6B, and a 4B. And I think this one I used a little bit, which I think is an 8B. So these are the pencils. If you're going to work with graphite, these are the ones I think you need if you want to work tonally, right? And with value. But it's not like you need the whole set, right? Like you only need a few of them. You need HB, 2B, 4B, 6B, 8B. Even then, you might not need the 8B because the 6B gets pretty dark. And I think you can make it work with just the 6B probably. In that case, you would only need like 4 pencils. You know, it's not like you need like 20 of them or something. But this was just on cheap computer paper, you know. We did a value scale, right? Figure out how the value scale works and kind of how to separate light and shadow. And then I did some animals, right? I drew like a walrus. I drew some penguins, a worm, like basically things that are easy to make out of basic shapes. I chose animals that are basically cylinders, right? Like this is basically just a cylinder. These penguins, essentially cylinders with wings is really what a penguin is. Same thing with this walrus, right? Like he's basically just a big tube with like some other tubes coming off of him. Head's a little more complicated, but that was kind of the idea. Keep things really, really simple. You know, really simple, and just talk about how stuff works. I don't know where my final drawing went. Oh, I do know. I put it on the fridge. I don't have the last one. But there was a final project where we just drew like some toys. No, you don't have to get it.
Okay. I think you strayed a little away from the question.
Well, what to do with the paper?
Oh no, like what recommended paper type?
Yeah, the point is, I don't think the actual paper is super important. You know, like you just need paper.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
If you're practicing. Cool. Now, where paper does become important is if you're doing like professional work or work that you want to be archival, or work that, like if you wanted to bring something up to like a really high quality finish, then I would use Bristol, like Bristol board. But aside from that, like I would just draw on printer paper.
Well, if they're drawing with charcoal, it might be too slippery.
Yeah, if you're using charcoal, I mean, that's all for graphite. So if you're using charcoal.
They ask free sketch with chalk or lead. And I would say...
Lead is graphite.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So like the smooth paper is good for graphite, whereas like if you have something chalky, it'll slide around a lot on the printer paper.
Yeah, I mean, when I did actual charcoal, like instead of like, the charcoal pencils, as a student, back when I took like regular charcoal classes where we were using like compressed charcoal sticks and like charcoal powder and stuff, I just used regular drawing paper. Like I just bought a pad of drawing paper. I didn't like the charcoal paper because it's too rough. Mm-hmm. The charcoal paper, I don't know, I don't really like it. So I just bought a pad of like Strathmore drawing paper and it worked fine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the difference is like if you're using like regular charcoal, like these pencils with smooth newsprint, they get the best of both worlds where you can get a full range of value and you can create really soft edges and fill things in really fast like with charcoal, but then you can also sharpen it in a way where you can get it up on the tip and get really fine lines like graphite. And so you can combine essentially everything you can do with graphite with everything you can do with charcoal into one thing, And so that's the advantage of training like with the smooth newsprint situation. If you're using just regular paper with regular charcoal, you can't get the same level of detail. You have to work more with big shapes and bigger forms and stuff, and you're kind of developing the large forms. And you won't be able to go in and do hatching and like, all the little like detail type things. And the difference I would recommend is look up, it's like the difference between the drawings you see at Watts, with like Jeff and Eric and Ben, versus if you look up Nathan Fowkes, who's amazing, or Nathan Fowkes or Steve Houston, both incredible artists, but use regular paper and charcoal. And if you look at their drawings and compare them to the Watts drawings, you'll see that they're not going into detail like they do in Watts. Like at Watts, like they usually pick a focal point that has a lot of detail, and then things become less detailed as you work your way out from the focal point. And then Nathan Fowkes and like Steve Houston, they're going more for like big forms and like modeling form, and they just work a little bit differently. Just as good, just different. Yeah.
Cool.
That's it. Can't remember whose drawing this is.
Pretty cool. I like it.
It is pretty cool. Oh, if you go to down where the images are, no, like down, here, and scroll up. Oh, that's the top, and then turn the top one off, the little eye thing. Boop, there we go.
Cool.
Yeah, that's the reference. Which looks pretty good. Pretty good. I would say the eyes are a little bit large and looking a little bit odd. I think what you're going for in this area is kind of the thing that you've probably seen me do a bunch of times, which is like if we're drawing an eye, whoops, right? And we're like, okay, here's our iris, right? We'll say, okay, the pupil, if the eyes turn this way, the pupil kind of gets pushed towards this side of the iris a little bit. And then what you'll typically see me do is figure out how the shadow is being cast down into the iris, because it's actually concave. And so we'll actually end up with a shadow kind of coming across here, right? And then it'll kind of merge with that dark pupil shape. And then we'll get shadow kind of like coming back this way. We'll get a shape kind of like that. But to be honest, her eyes are so dark that you can't actually see that. I'm sure I've done that when I draw her, but it's very subtle in there. Very, very subtle, because she has very dark eyes. And then essentially this top section is shadow. And then this bottom part is the part picking up the light. And I think that's kind of what you're doing here, but I think the shadow is pushed too low. And so it's almost creating an effect where it feels like she has like a really big or like a really thick lower eyelid. And it's just feeling a little bit odd. Let me look at it on the computer and make sure I'm seeing this properly, because I know my printer prints things too light. Yeah, so I think what's happening, right, is, remember what I just showed, is we get this kind of shape inside the eye when the shadow is being cast into the iris. But I feel like you're pushing the shadow too low right in here. And so you have like shadow and then just a little bit of iris and then shadow. And you're creating this like huge shadow shape up in here. But there's not enough eyelid up here to kind of like, I don't know, or not enough shadow on the eye to justify this much shadow in the iris. And then the eyes are also a little bit large. I don't know, we'll work our way up to that. I don't know why I started talking about that immediately. That's more like a detail type thing. First, what I want to talk about is the big shape, right? So the first thing I notice when I look at this is your drawing feels longer than the reference, right? Like her head shape feels long. Not like super long, but it's a little bit long. And, you know, the angle of the hair feels a little bit off, right? It's tough to see. I can see it on my computer because I have your photo on the computer, but the printout's kind of light. But you have this kind of like angle for the hair here. And in the reference, to me, that looks a little more vertical. Not perfectly straight up and down, but pretty close. And I think you have too much forehead out here. And the head might be a little bit wide. I don't know. This is a really tough head to draw. Let's see if I can do this. Let's find a little bit of cranial mass. Right, so we're looking, she has her head tilted down a little bit. Like we're kind of looking down at her head. So we're going to see a little bit more of the top of her head than we normally would. So we'll have kind of our cranial mass type shape. Right, and then we get kind of the side plane of the head. Kind of dropping down this way. And then this part kind of dropping down this way. Right, so we need to kind of create this shape a little bit better, right? More delineation between the corner of the jaw and the side of the head. Right here, this feels like it's just kind of like a big rounded shape right through here. And I kind of see where you're getting that from, but I think that's partly because the hair is kind of sticking out. And in the reference, to me, it clearly looks like we have kind of like the back of her jaw here, and then the corner is like, there's definitely like a change in direction in there, in the jaw, right? And then I think the face is a little bit too long, right? So we're gonna need to kind of like pull it back up a little bit. You know, we're seeing like more of the top of her head as well. And then be careful, right now you have kind of like the hairline up here, but in the reference, I feel like it's shifted over a little bit more, right? Like it's a little too far to the side. Part of that could be because you're kind of missing a chunk of hair here, but I feel like if you put that in, then this section would feel maybe a little bit small, although it does look pretty small on her. Let's see what happens. right? So you can see kind of how I'm pulling the hairline down a little bit more and kind of shrinking. We're just kind of shrinking the face. And then the center line, of course, is going to be at an angle here because her head is tilted down. That wasn't a great center line. Ended up with two of them. All right, so it's kind of tilted down a bit. Double check that angle. It's pretty good. Right, now we got to break the face into thirds, but her head's tilted down a little bit. So most likely the bottom third is going to be a little bit smaller than usual. And then the top two will be a little bit bigger. So I'm actually going to lean over to my computer real quick and just measure and double check and see if I'm right. They're pretty equal, actually. Pretty equal. Her head's not tilted down very much, and I've drawn her a bunch of times. So I know that if she had her head turned up and looked straight at us, the bottom third on her is a little bit larger than the top two. Typically. And so now that she has her head tilted down a little bit, it kind of makes it so that they're all pretty equal, right? So I think we can just go here and find equal thirds. And I'm just kind of taking my best guess. This isn't quite right. This middle one's too big, way too big. So you can see, I mean, it's not like my first try goes perfectly, right? Like, I've been doing this long enough that there's a lot of times where when I do this, it'll be right on the first try, but not always. I still have to correct things, change things, measure things occasionally. So that's pretty close, right? That gets those top, the hairline just up just a little bit maybe. Right, so we get our equal thirds. And let me double check our angle here. Seems pretty good. Yeah, so we're kind of bringing things in both ways and kind of shrinking the head a bit. Now, what happens when the head tilts down like this, and it's not super pronounced on her because her head's not tilted down very much, but frequently the tip of the nose will drop down below this line. And so it'll make this line seem like it's lower than it actually is. And that might be happening here a tiny bit, but not very much. Let's also find kind of where the side plane is going to sit, like our separation between front and side plane of the head, right? As though we're dealing with a box, right? And notice we're seeing a little bit of side plane over here, right? Which is weird because her head's turned this way, so you don't think we should, but we actually do a little bit because the front of the head is actually more narrow than the back, you know? So the head has to turn pretty far to get to the point where we don't see any side plane at all. You can see that the top of my skull fell off, but you can see it here, right? If we look at this skull, right? When you look at it from the front, you're actually seeing the side here and here, right? Quite a bit. And so the head can turn pretty far and still see some of that side plane, right? And if you look at it from the top, even though the top fell off, you can see how wide it is back here versus how narrow it is at the front. Like the whole thing is shaped like this, right? So even though her head is turned, we're still seeing a little bit of side plane over here, which is kind of tricky. And then yeah, and then we can kind of see now that her head is angled, if we kind of extend these lines as though this were wrapping around a box, right? We get something kind of like that. And so now her ear is going to sit kind of up in this middle third up here, although she has kind of a small ear, so it's going to be like here. You know, it'll sit kind of like right up in that space. You know, her hairline is going from here. And then for her, she has kind of an interesting hairline that kind of drops down a bit on each side. Kind of does this and this. And it sort of cuts across. And then down for the, like the sideburn section. Kind of down this way. Like some of that sideburn in there. Right, and then we get some of the same thing over here where it's cutting across. And then maybe just a little bit of sideburn showing. Don't think we're seeing the other ear at all. Her head's turned far enough that that other ear has disappeared, and we're just seeing like some hair pop out from over here. You know, and then from there we can go in and kind of continue to break things down. And it looks like, it's tough to see on the printout, but when I look at the computer, this is pretty much what you did. I mean, it's just a matter of being a little bit more careful. Like I can see your construction lines. The one you have right here to kind of separate your front and side plane, I think just needs to angle in a little bit more, right? Because remember, the front plane of the face, it's not like a perfect box. It kind of like angles in a little bit. And so you can see I've kind of like, compared to the center line, I've taken this one and angled it in just a little bit. And yeah, and then we'll come in here and start kind of developing some of the glabella. Right, and then we have kind of like the inside of this eye socket in here. Right, and then we're going to get the brow bone kind of cutting across and then over around this corner. Right, so it kind of rounds around this side plane, or like the kind of where we found the corner of the head as though it were a box. Remember, the head's not actually a box, right? So we got to kind of like round it out a little bit around the corner. And then we'll come in here and kind of start finding, you know, what's the shape of her eye sockets in here. Kind of sitting about like this. Maybe kind of like that. This one's kind of doing the same thing, comes over a little bit, rounds around this corner, and then it's kind of dropping out this way. You know, it's kind of that far eye socket. You know, find the sweep of the nose. Kind of right down in here. It's starting to look okay. Something about this eye socket that feels a little bit small. I think we can push it to be a little bit larger because we want the outside of the bone for the temple here, the zygomatic, I think is going to come out a little bit more. Yeah, that feels a little better. You know, and now her nose, we have to be really careful. It kind of sweeps down, and then the ball of her nose kind of pops out a little bit. And then it's going to kind of drop down and back. Kind of sit right down in here. Right. One thing I'm going to look for is what is the width of the nose, right? So if we go from the tear duct and draw a line that kind of parallels roughly this line, it should kind of help us find the side plane of the nose. And her nose is very thin, so her head's turned far enough that we're not really seeing the side plane from this angle. Right, get a little bit of nostril in here. And then we're kind of picking up a little bit of the opening right up in here. Just ever so slightly. Might even get rid of this line because it's very subtle on her. You know, we don't want to overdo it. Can even make her nose a little bit thinner, maybe. I don't know. That's close. I think if I zoom in, I know you can't do this on the computer, but if I zoom in and look really close, I think we're seeing just a little tiny bit of the far nostril. So we have to decide if we want to include that or not. It would probably, well, I was about to say maybe not, but it kind of feels like it needs it. Just a little bit, and it'll be in shadow. It won't even be that noticeable really by the time you like render it and stuff. But I think it'll be good to have on there possibly. Right, and then we get this bottom third, we break it into thirds. Which will look something like that. Again, we can measure if we need to, double check. Pretty close. Right, and then we're picking up some of the tooth cylinder. Only from this angle, it's not very pronounced, but there's maybe a little bit of tooth cylinder showing, right, which is going to have a little bit of a rounded type shape to it. And then the chin, of course, kind of sticking out down here. The corners of the mouth, roughly here maybe. Kind of like right around in there. Her chin is a little bit separated from the rest of her jaw. So I'm going to put it in there, and if it doesn't look right, I'll just reconnect it. It needs to be really subtle. You know, and then we can go in here and kind of find like her lip type. You know, so construction-wise, that's where everything needs to go. Now it's a matter of like kind of working out all these little details and maybe kind of lighten some things, right? The chin's going to sit down here, right? The mouth is going to connect kind of down in here. So we see the philtrum here, right? Then we get like the body of the lip. Connecting out to the node out on the corner. Same thing on this side, right? We get body of the lip connecting out to the node. You know, and now her head is tilted down a little bit, so we're going to get kind of a more pronounced shape to like the tubercle, and just the lip in general. Right in there, right? Bottom lip coming down and almost touching the chin down here. Sitting down in there. Doesn't look exactly like her, but part of that is because there's no eyebrows and no information up in here yet, right? So we need to figure out kind of where the eyes are going to sit up in here. Right, so now I'm looking for kind of where the opening of the eye socket is, right? Because that first line we put down is really more like the, kind of like where the brow bone pokes out the farthest, right? Is kind of where that measurement line goes for the brow. And then essentially underneath there a little bit is the actual opening of the eye socket. Right, so we can come in here and maybe add some eyebrows. That might be helpful. We're gonna have one starting right about here. The other roughly about here. Maybe kind of like that. All right, and then we'll see if we can kind of maybe draw a good eyebrow shape on here. All right, kind of pops up and over. Something kind of like that. All right, this one kind of similar, pops up again this way and then kind of over this direction. Now what's tough is a lot of people's, in fact, I would say almost most people's eyebrows aren't really even. There's usually one that sits a little bit higher than the other, and I know that's partly what's happening here. And so you kind of have to decide like how much of that you want to include in your drawing, or if you want to like kind of even it back out a little bit. Either way is fine. All right, get that other eyebrow up in there. And then our eyes are going to sit basically right in here. You know, and in reality, if we wanted to, we can kind of figure out like where the actual eye socket closes, right? Kind of like in here. We don't really need that, but for construction purposes, it's good to understand what's really happening, you know, and then we get like kind of that kind of glabella keystone shape up in that section, kind of like up in here. Right, and then our eyes need to kind of drop in that space. And hopefully, sorry, I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but I'm just kind of adjusting things a little bit here and there as I feel like it needs it, just to kind of improve the likeness. Make sure things aren't too angular. You know, I started with things kind of squared off to figure out where they go, but like, you know, her head isn't super angular. So, you know, I'm kind of rounding things back out now. And then also we need to go in here and figure out how these eyes sit in here, which is always a challenge. So remember, part of what I was saying earlier was these eyes feel too big, but I feel like part of that is coming from the big white area right here. It's feeling like there's a really thick lower lid. And again, I already talked about that, like how that has to do kind of with how that iris is designed. So let's see if we can just go in here real quick and figure out how to get this eye in here. So we get kind of like our tear duct over here, right? And then the eye, since her head's tilted down, what's interesting here is this part is relatively flat across here, right? And then it's mostly this lower part now that's really round. Again, we get tear duct. And we get this part. Kind of sitting in there like that. Right, so the upper lid is a little less pronounced. You know, it's not like as rounded as usual. And then the bottom lid is more rounded because her head's tilted down. You know, and then we're seeing tear duct over here. We get the thickness of the lid showing. Kind of right down around here, and then a little bit of bottom lid maybe. Don't want to draw too much because that would really be handled more tonally. I just want to like imply what's going on. Right, and then we have the upper lid kind of tucking up under the brow bone. So we have to figure out how to do that. So it's kind of like we get a narrow section here, and then it kind of cuts over and across that way, and then kind of back down a little bit. And then the train goes by. This eye, now here's what's challenging, is her head's turned and she's kind of looking off to one side a little bit. So we need to make sure that the other eye, and it kind of works in a similar way, only here we're going to have things wrapping this direction. Oh, no, that wasn't good. Try that again. The other eye always takes me a few tries, so if that happens, don't worry too much about it. It's pretty typical. Still too big. It's a little better. Right, so we'll have tear duct right about there. We're getting the lid kind of popping up over here. All right, kind of up around that way. And just like this one, the lower lid now is kind of wrapping kind of down pretty far and then back up. You know, and then we're seeing a little bit of that lower, or the top plane of the lower lid. Kind of right down in there, right? A little bit of the lower lid itself. Again, I don't want to draw too much of that right now. But those are kind of the eye shapes I think I would go with. Actually, here, let's see if we can drop. Oh, that's maximum zoom. Okay, I found where it maxes out. Let's see if we can drop some irises in here, right? So let's see. They're kind of sitting like this. And like this. You know, because she's kind of like looking off to one side a little bit. This one I think needs to be a little bigger. Again, it's okay if you need to adjust these. Just that's partly why we want to draw as simple as possible at first, because there's a very high probability that these will need to be changed. Although as you improve and get better and better, that will always be the case. Right, and then we can drop those little iris shapes in there, which are going to be even smaller. This drawing is getting pretty small. I've zoomed way, way in, but really this drawing is, you know, it's smaller than my hand. It's not huge. But remember what I was talking about a second ago? It's kind of how the iris, or how the pupil sits within the iris. But the thing is, her eyes are so dark that the only reason I would put this in is because I'm not going to render it. If I were to render this, then I probably wouldn't bother with doing, with doing this next part. Also, I still don't like the shape of this iris right here. It's good enough. But remember, these now are going to sit, right? We'll get a little bit of shadow here, and pupil, and a little bit of shadow. Right, kind of like that. Same thing here, a little bit of shadow, pupil, a little bit of shadow. Wow, that one was really small. I'll try that again. I should probably sharpen my pencil. It's okay. I don't know. That one wasn't the best. This one looks pretty good. Not super happy with that one, but I don't know. Can't win them all. Also, I don't want to make you watch me redraw the same thing 20 times. Ooh, there, that was pretty good. There we go. Yeah, much better. But again, her eyes are so dark that you can't really see that. Like in reality, if I were to go render this whole thing, I don't think I would worry about that too much. I'm just drawing it because I know I'm not going to render it. So that's kind of what I would do with the eyes, right? Because that's the two things that stood out to me here when we look at this whole drawing is everything's a little bit too tall. We need a better kind of separation between the back of the jaw and the bottom of the jaw and side plane of the head. And then kind of correct those eye shapes a little bit. See if we can get them looking a little bit more like they do in the reference. You know, and then from there we can go in and kind of find maybe a little bit of her neck. Coming back this way, a little bit of the collar. Coming out from here.
Brian, can I read you some questions now that you're working
Oh.
on the shirt and
Yeah,
stuff?
yeah.
Or robe.
Yeah.
Let's see. There are a variety of questions throughout this one, but I
Okay.
didn't want to
Yeah, that's okay.
kind of throw you off. Or,
Yeah.
Not that you get thrown off, but. Okay, so. Let me see. There's someone who's asking if you've ever met John Asaro because he lives in San Diego.
I have not met him, but he does live, I think, over in Escondido. And there was one time when I was at Watts, back when I was a student, that he stopped by to drop off what at the time was like a prototype for the figure model that he sells. That's kind of like the Asaro head, but like in figure, like the full figure Asaro head. And he was working on developing that. And I guess he had like some prototypes or something left over and he just wanted to drop one off at the school. So we had one, I guess. And he stopped by and dropped it off and talked to Eric for a minute and left. I didn't talk to him or anything. I was just sitting there drawing. It happened behind me. So that's the only John Asaro sighting that I've had.
Saw him in the wild.
I did, yeah.
Okay, let's see. So the next question is from Isaiah. Isaiah asked, oh, the question disappeared. What the?
Maybe he deleted it.
I think he may have.
Isaiah, did you change your mind?
Tricky guy. I was just about to read your question. Okay, let's see. Is tracing mostly user? Okay, I think he reposted the question.
Oh, okay.
Possibly? I don't know what just happened, but his comment moved. It says, is tracing mostly used for critique drawings, or is that also used to develop shape language? I think it's the same question. Maybe he rephrased it or something.
Okay. I mean, what I'm doing, I wouldn't consider tracing. Like, this is just me drawing on top of another drawing, essentially. But, like, I'm not really tracing anything. I mean, it's like a completely different drawing. But in terms of using tracing paper, yeah, I mean, this is a good way to do a critique, for sure. Because you can get, like, a one-to-one comparison between your drawing and my drawing and see exactly how it works. So primarily that's what I use tracing paper for. But if you're asking about, you know, actual tracing, it is a good way to learn shape language as like a way to study shape design and really anything. I mean, to be honest, it's not something I did much of, but I know really good artists that have learned a lot and kind of recommend tracing things. And whether it's like magazine photos or tracing a reference photo or tracing somebody else's drawing, the key, I think, would be to just not do too much of it. You know, make sure that you're doing enough of it that you're kind of learning, but also not just doing that just because it turns out looking good and, you know, it's fun to do and easy. I don't know about easy. Tracing's kind of hard, actually, to do it well. But yeah, I think it's fine. It's fine as like a training technique, for sure.
All right, now we have another question from RF who asked, I think he asked this earlier when you were about to start drawing the eyes.
Oh, yeah.
He asked, how do you find the form of barely visible lips? I find those very difficult to draw.
Barely visible lips. Like, I'm guessing you mean like a specific lip type where there's like kind of like hardly any lip. And if that's the case, then you're right. They're kind of hard to draw. I would say really they get really thin, and there's a point where you're kind of almost just drawing like a line almost. You know, like literally that's kind of your lip shape. And but yeah, they can be really thin. They work the same way. There's usually still a little bit of a philtrum. You get a little bit of the body of the lip, right? Maybe a little bit of a node, maybe not, depending on the person. You know, and they're just incredibly thin. But I would say mostly it just takes practice. Practice, and then as usual, I would recommend finding drawings of lips like that. Like if you recognize like, okay, this is a weak point, right? I'm having trouble drawing people that have kind of thin lips, right? Go look for some drawings that have thin lips that are pretty good, you know, and that you look at and think like, hey, these are some pretty good thin lip drawings, and do a little study of them and figure out what they're doing and why and how to get them to read. What's tough is they follow all the same ideas and principles. You know, they have the same anatomy. They're just really thin, and it's a challenge, definitely. You know, would this shadow even be down here? This little shadow that kind of sits underneath the bottom lip. If somebody has really thin lips, their bottom lip might not protrude out enough to actually create a shadow here, which can be challenging. Yeah, my recommendation would be find someone to copy that has some good thin lip drawings, you know, and find that thing. And it's good that you recognize that it's a weakness, because that means it gives you something to work on. And it probably won't be a weakness for too long if you put that effort in to seek those out and figure out kind of how that works. And I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't really know. I can't recommend a thin lip drawing, but I'm sure I could probably find one. I don't think they're going to be that tough to find. It's a common lip type, especially amongst men, but not always men.
Oh, yeah. He specified thin lips.
Yeah.
Yeah, thin lips.
Cool.
Good interpretation of the question then.
What? That was what you said.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Oh.
But you knew what he meant before he clarified, so good job.
Good.
Okay, so the next one is from Ben. Ben Nissen Art. He says, hey Brian, love the channel, super helpful. Could you explain how to figure out the correct foot construction in a figure drawing so that it meets the ground plane properly? Is there a system to do it? Oh man, that's a foot question in the middle of the
That's a tough one. That, I mean, if you're talking about how to find the ground plane, that's a big question, because that gets into perspective and basically being able to figure out where is the ground in perspective. And then there's something that's kind of like, I don't know, at Watts I would hear him use the term riding the rails. You know, so you have to figure out exactly where your person is, and then essentially figuring out how big they are, and then you can kind of like, in perspective, wrap lines around either buildings or streets or whatever to figure out exactly where that point would be for a foot to go, you know. But that's kind of the tough way to do it, the easier way. And to be honest, I don't do a lot of that because ever since I started teaching, I mostly just teach head and figure drawing. I'm not teaching a ton of like illustration stuff or anything. And so usually what I draw is stuff more like this. If I can find it here. Oh, here's a couple pages, right? Here's a page of feet. I taught a class last term about feet, right? So I've got a whole bunch of feet. Notice what I'm doing here is creating boxes for the feet. Each one of these starts as a box. There's a clear like perspective here, right? I'm creating a little boxy shape. The heel is flat. In this case, right, like if we look at any of these, right, we can see there's a box in here, right? And that essentially is exactly what I was saying. It becomes a perspective problem at that point. You know, I've practiced drawing boxes over and over and over, so I can just draw a box that's like kind of the shape that I need it, and then kind of construct a foot around it. But I don't usually deal with ground planes all that much, you know, because I'm not doing like full illustrations most of the time. But each one of these follows that principle. If you can get to the point where you can draw a nice solid box in perspective and learn perspective well enough that you can place that box on the ground, then you should be able to place a foot on the ground. You know, I mean, it's really, I don't want to say it's that simple because it's not actually a simple thing at all. It's pretty complicated, but that's really what it comes down to. Right here, you can see I found a box first. This started out as like a boxy shape. And I drew my box, and then I kind of constructed the foot around it. Same with this one, same with this one. I mean, you can see that box in there. You know, I mean, it's really clear. I've got a whole nother page of feet. This one was a little less clear, but you can see right in here, the part that's actually touching the ground. This foot wasn't totally on the ground, which is kind of what makes this tricky. So maybe it's not the best example, but you can see I'm still pushing a box shape in there quite a bit, right? Same thing here. I'm like actually working out what that box and then building around it, you know, and that's why I tell people constantly to draw basic shapes, right? Because your ability to draw boxes and cylinders in whatever position they need to be in really affects the whole thing, right? This one's really clear. I mean, this is a clear box. So if we were setting up an illustration or I don't know, whatever we're drawing, and it was going to be like a full scene and we had to have a person sitting on the ground or standing on the ground, then we would have to work out where that ground plane is in perspective, and this little boxy shape right here that I'm drawing would sit on the ground, you know? But I don't want to take the time to explain that because it would take a while and I would have to do like a whole perspective drawing, and I don't necessarily want to do that right now. But that's kind of the quick answer. Is there more? Should I tape up another one of these? I'm going to do one more, but I'm going to do it kind of quick because we're running out of time.
Okay.
Yeah, but there is one more that got turned in that I think would be good to show because it was somebody that worked from last week's live stream and then turned their drawing in to be critiqued, which was kind of cool.
There are two more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'll read them off to you real quick. One is from Brickman, who says, Brian, have you thought about making a stream where you draw from your imagination to see how your process, or how to use your process in a more comic context, like a comic book style?
Yeah, I've considered it. I'll be honest, I don't think I'm at the point where I want to do a live stream with it yet, but it's something I've been working on. I've taught one invention class. It was okay. I mean, I can do it, but I don't feel like I'm fast enough at it yet to be able to do it as a live stream. I feel like you just watch me correct things a lot and it would be kind of boring. But it's something that I've been practicing, and I'm going to be teaching more classes that are going to be like comic and invention oriented. You know, like I want to teach like a comic book style figure drawing class is one of my plans. That would be like part invention, part kind of like how do you stylize things as comics. But then also we could have weeks where you work from reference and say maybe take like a reference drawing and turn that into like a comic book style drawing followed by weeks where you do it more like invention style. I mean, I've got a number of things like that that I want to do. And as I do more of them, I will get more warmed up doing that kind of stuff and get faster. And eventually, yeah, I could do a live stream doing that, but probably not like next week or anything. Yeah.
Cool. Next question is from Celsius, who says, I feel like my shading comes out better on the tracing paper than on the newsprint. Maybe it's the texture or just drawing it a second time, possibly.
That's pretty common. In fact, I always remember Jeff telling a story. Like, I'll be honest, working on tracing paper is easier. It's like cheating a little bit because the tone just goes down way smoother and faster. And there are disadvantages to it. You can't get as much detail on it. And, you know, so it's not all advantages. But it's like cheating a little bit. And I remember Jeff always telling this story from back when he was a student. He would like, you know, he went to a school that worked the same way as Watts. So they would do like draw over critiques with tracing paper. And he tried it one time when he was a student and he realized like, oh, you know what, working on tracing paper, it's a lot easier to get soft edges. You can build up tone really fast. You can actually work faster. And there's things about it that are easier. And so he just started working on tracing paper in class and was immediately told to not do that. And so he kind of tells everybody the same thing, which is don't work on tracing paper unless you're like an instructor trying to critique a drawing. And the reason for that is because it gives you like a false sense of being good at things, you know, because you can't work on tracing paper forever. You know, what you want is a situation that's actually kind of hard. And then when you go to work in other mediums, the things that you're learning will kind of transfer to those mediums. And so working on smooth newsprint with charcoal, it's really hard. It requires a ton of dexterity. The only thing that maybe requires more dexterity is like maybe inking, because inking requires a ton of dexterity. Painting also, but it's kind of like a different type of dexterity. It's just a little bit different. And yeah, so you want to like work.
I think I just heard the mouse trap.
Really? Oh,
I'm
cool.
gonna go check.
Okay. So you want to work in a way where you actually have to challenge yourself and build the dexterity to get that full value range on the newsprint and to get like the fine strokes and the soft edges, hard edges. And that way you'll be building skills that then transfer to graphite or transfer to inking or whatever else it is that you want to do. But if you only trained on tracing paper where everything's really easy, then as soon as you go to do something else, like you pick up, you're like, oh, now I need to work in graphite. You're not going to be able to do it. It's going to be really hard. So that's the reason why. But you're right that working on tracing paper is a little bit easier, or at least there's things about it that are a little bit easier. Also, I think we captured the mouse.
Yep.
We did? We got it?
We got it.
We got the mouse.
We got it,
Nice.
everybody.
We've been trying to catch a mouse for like 2 months. No joke.
It's so cute.
Good. It's really smart. I seriously, when it showed up, I was like, well, we're going to find out who's smarter, me or the mouse. And every night, it's the mouse. It's been smarter for a long time.
We've been
But I
feeding
finally
hot
did it.
dog for 2 months.
Yeah, I've been feeding it pieces of hot dogs. I don't want to go up on the counter. And,
Well, I mean, feeding it, trying to catch it, and it just
well, yeah.
somehow gets the
Well, at
hot
first I
dog.
just started out feeding it, but then we bought like a little trap and we've been putting hot dog like a little bit in front of it and then like kind of slowly moving the hot dog into the trap because at first it wouldn't go in there. And now we got it going in, but then they're like really tiny mice. It's like really small. And they didn't weigh enough to set off the trap. So we got them going in there and then they just go in and take the hot dog and leave and they don't set the trap off.
Yep.
So finally I taped some coins to the little lever that sets it off to weigh it down so that it takes less weight to set it off. I guess it worked. We caught the mouse.
Is in there.
Yeah.
I put the towel over so it's not too
That's
scary.
good. Yeah. The trap said it was designed to mimic a mouse den or something.
Oh, well, then
So hopefully
that
it's
might be like a
comfortable in there.
vacation
Yeah.
for it.
Okay. Let's do one more of these. This is going to have to be kind of quick because we're out of time. This is getting super long. But where's my reference? There we go. So this is from last week's live stream. Was this Alfonso's drawing?
Brickman says You should make a drawing of the mouse for celebration.
That'd be cool. We should draw the mouse.
It's really cute.
Maybe we could do a little photo shoot with it.
Yeah.
We can do like a little mouse photo shoot.
Yeah.
Maybe
I
not.
don't know if it would like
I don't want to get like hantavirus or whatever.
It's not going to give you hantavirus, but
if it hasn't done it by now, it probably won't. Yeah.
It looks really scared though. It's kind of shivering.
I bet.
So
It's just stuck in a little trap. Yeah. They don't like hanging out with us. They try to avoid us as much as possible. But I wouldn't mind drawing it. Okay, so we got one more of these. This has pretty nice construction, right? Construction-wise, there's not like a ton to do other than maybe change the big shape of the head a little bit. The thing I would talk about here more is edge variation, right? Because you're going in and doing what I did, which is kind of mapping these shadow shapes. But you have basically the same edge everywhere, right? Like, yeah, your hard edges have a thin line, which is good, as it should be. And then you've got like your softer edges have a thicker line, but not necessarily softer, right? So I'll kind of show you what the difference is, right? So let's work over here maybe, right? So you've got like these kind of thinner lines, right? For like the bottom of the shadow, right? And like maybe your cast shadows or the end of a form shadow or something, right? But then in your other shadows, you've got stuff kind of like this, which is pretty good. I mean, there's definitely a design difference between your really thin lines and the thicker lines. The problem is they're not necessarily soft. Like there is a little bit of softness to them, but it's kind of like the same level of softness almost everywhere, right? And we want more variation. Some of that could be my fault because I don't remember exactly what my drawing looked like. I guess I can find it real quick. It's a demo from my head tilt class, foreshortening class. Aha, right? So notice what's happening here, right? We've got soft edge up around here, but then here it gets like even softer a little bit. But part of that is just because that's where the eyebrow is and it's hitting the eyebrow. But then notice here I'm pushing this is a lot softer than this, which now that I'm looking at the reference, I kind of regret that. I think this should be really soft too. I think they should both be really soft. And then we've got this down here like is really soft, right? And so that softness is determined by how round the form is. So what we end up with, and if anybody's been in my classes, I'm sure you've seen me do this a bunch of times, but like how round or how not round, how angular a form is what's going to determine the level of softness, right? So if we have a shape that's like, that turns slowly, right? Something like this, right? It's a pretty slow turning form versus maybe something like this. Oh, that wasn't a great shape. Oh, it's gonna have to do. Running out of time here. Right, so we've got two different forms. One turning more quickly than the other. Right, this one's turning quick, this one's turning much more slowly. And then usually I draw one more that's like an angle, right? So it kind of does like this. Right, we get one that turns at an angle. Right, so what's the difference between them? Essentially, if they're being lit kind of from like above, up here, right, this one is going to have a really, really soft edge as it rolls into shadow, right, because it's happening really slowly. So this is going to be really, really soft. Right, this is going to be soft, but not as soft as this. It's going to be like just a little bit soft, right? Because it's rolling into shadow much more quickly. And here it's happening really slowly, right? Versus here it's happening like instantaneously, right? So we get like a hard edge because it's angular form, right? So if we fill these in, right, we get something like that versus something kind of like that versus kind of like that. Now, usually once you fill them in, you kind of have to go back and adjust them a little bit. Like you can see this edge got harder when I filled it in. So we have to go back and kind of just re-soften it a little bit. You know, maybe soften this one a little bit more. And then we could argue and say, hey, maybe these actually have core shadows, right? So if we were dealing with core shadows, assuming it's in a situation where there's reflected light, then the core shadow is also going to follow that same level of softness. So in this case, we'll have like a really soft core shadow. You know, something like that maybe. And then here we're going to have a thinner core shadow. Again, that mimics that same level of softness on both sides. You know, something a little bit more like that versus here, I don't know, we just get like a gradient maybe or something. I don't know. It just comes up and hits that hard edge. So I got like a weird dark spot in there. Right? So that's kind of what's guiding our edges. So if I look here, right, we can see that the roundness of this form versus the roundness of this kind of like secondary form here versus the roundness of the cheek are all like a little bit different, right? They're kind of like this is probably turning the slowest out of all of them. So we're probably going to get our softest edge right in here. And then the rest of them just need to be soft. I mean, I just need to push it a little bit more. And part of the other key is you just want variation. Right now, it just feels too much the same everywhere. So as a drawing, like we want to push more variation in our edges just to make it more interesting. I mean, we want it to be accurate also, but we also want it to be interesting. The other thing is the shape of the head, right? Like I feel like we're seeing too much of this, considering that we're looking up at him and his head's tilted back slightly. We need to find a little bit more of like a tilted cranial mass type shape. You know, kind of like that maybe. You know, so you can see we're picking up more of an angle here. You have a little bit of that, but it's not pronounced enough. It's taking his head and like pulling it back around so it's not tilted back a little bit. Right, so we can get rid of those construction lines. Right, we get our center line kind of tilted back just a little bit. Hairline's going to be like way up here at the top because, again, we're looking up at him a bit. You know, we'll get, we're also getting a little bit of perspective on the head as well, right? So this is actually going to be kind of angled. And that comes from the fact that I was probably standing too close to him when I took the photo. And I've drawn him a bunch of times, even back when he had a much thinner beard. And so I know that his jaw is really big. So much so that it's like almost like a whole chin length longer than these two, right? So we've got to have these two relatively equal or close to it, and then this one needs to be considerably bigger, right? Like I've got like an almost extra chin length down here. And that's just the way his head is, you know, and part of learning to draw is learning to recognize when people kind of deviate from the generic measurements that we learn. You know, so if we learn that someone's head is, or like a generic head is going to have equal thirds for the face, then we also have to learn later that, you know, people deviate from that as well. And there's a lot of people that have like a large bottom third or a small forehead. Sometimes you'll see people that have like a small or large middle third. I mean, it happens, you know. But part of the reason we want to learn those generic measurements is so then we can go in and figure out and see kind of more quickly when people deviate from them.
Got some questions for you.
Okay.
Celsius said soup's up. Oh no, about the
Oh
mouse.
no.
Okay, mouse will live. We're just gonna take it outside.
Maybe he's a ratatouille mouse. Maybe he'll make soup for
You
us.
can put it on your hair and it can control you.
Yeah.
That's a rat, I think, in Ratatouille.
Oh.
I mean, it's not Mouseatouille.
Well, maybe it will be.
Okay, and so the actual question part. Celsius says that makes sense about the tracing paper, and taking the easy way makes it harder down the road, definitely. And then Isaiah asked, what are your thoughts on Norman Rockwell?
Norman Rockwell was probably one of the best illustrators and painters that ever lived. In my opinion, the only person that was better than him was Leyendecker.
Wasn't he a stalker for Leyendecker?
That's the story I always heard. Was that like Rockwell was like kind of like obsessed with Leyendecker to the point where he even like followed him around for a while and like mimicked his limp that he had, and I don't know, it sounded a little bit weird. Yeah. I think Rockwell might have been a little bit of a strange dude.
Artists are known for their
yeah.
Okay. Then, unless you had more comments on Rockwell.
No, he was super good, man. I mean, if you want somebody to study that's really good, Rockwell would be the guy. Although I like Leyendecker more personally. I like his design sense and how heavily designed everything is. I just like it. So, but they're both incredibly good.
Oh, I had a quick comment about that.
Okay.
You have a ton of Rockwell books,
Yeah.
as well as books with reproductions of other artists.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, this is a question for the chat, if you all would be interested in like a stream where Brian goes through the books and just like talks through some of the paintings. Because I personally love looking at them and then hearing your commentary about them. So I'm curious if other people would like that type of a stream.
Guessing they probably would.
I think it would be really interesting. Just a kind of like a breakdown of the technique and different thoughts on them. Okay, so moving on. Someone named Alone says, Brian, I need your advice. I have been trying to learn how to draw for the last 10 years, but I don't see any improvement in my drawings even after spending all this time learning the art fundamentals.
I mean, I would need more information. I know a lot of people spend a lot of time drawing and don't improve. And it happens. The thing that I have noticed in the past with myself was that I would frequently not improve until I spent like longer periods of time drawing, which sounds weird, but you kind of need to do that to build dexterity. And so I don't know, like I don't know how much your time you're spending drawing, how much time you're, and exactly what you're doing and what you have been doing. Maybe you did too many fundamentals. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly without knowing exactly what's going on. But I guess what I'm getting at is I've known a lot of people that they're like, I really want to learn to draw, but they're doing something like, say, working full time. So they can only draw like maybe like an hour in the morning, and maybe like in the evening when they get home from work, they have maybe like an hour or two that they can draw. And they don't improve a whole lot. And that's frustrating. I mean, obviously that's going to be pretty frustrating. And in my experience, just with my own improvement, I kind of went through the same thing a little bit, and it wasn't until I started spending longer periods of time drawing. And you don't have to do it all the time, right? Like if you have 15 minutes here and there to sketch, or an hour or whatever, do it, because it's important. You'll learn some stuff. But in terms of building dexterity, it wasn't until I started spending much longer periods of time drawing, like 6 hours at a time, 8 hours at a time, to the point where my arm got like really tired. And like I was like, man, my arm's like wiped out. It wasn't until I would do that I would like improve, kind of. So like if you're only spending little short chunks of time drawing, you're going to have trouble building the dexterity that you need and developing your eye to do what it needs to do. And so you'll need to kind of like spend more time drawing. And usually what I recommend in those instances, because I have a lot of people that take classes that are like, I'm working full time and I also want to become an illustrator. And I've seen people pull that off. It's really hard and it takes a ton of effort, but it's possible. I know people that have done it. And I know people that have managed Starbucks and done that while training to be an illustrator. I know people that have worked at grocery stores full time and become illustrators. But they work really hard, and they spend exactly kind of like what I was saying. Like they wake up early, they draw in the morning for a while, and then they work all day, and then they come home. And then one of the keys, I think, is that they also typically find time to spend longer periods of time, usually on a weekend, some time off. So my recommendation usually is at least once a week, more if you can do it, is spend much longer periods of time drawing, like 6 hours, 8 hours. Basically, you might have to work your way up to it, because if you're not used to doing it, that might be too much. But just push yourself until your arm gets really tired. And you're like, dang, man, my arm is tired. I'm having trouble like lifting it. It's not working well. That's what should happen if you're training enough, because it's like working out. Like if you don't work your muscles out to the point where they get exhausted and wiped out, they won't rebuild in the way that makes them stronger. So you have to do the exact same thing building dexterity for drawing. And your eye and brain kind of work the same way too. If you don't really push yourself, it doesn't happen. So again, I don't know what your situation is. I just know I've seen people hit that problem, and in my opinion, that's part of it. But without more information, and you're welcome to send me more information as well, right? Like, I mean, we have like a contact form on our website. I mean, you can email us and tell me and say like, hey, look, here's how I've been training. I've been doing this much per week, or here's how much I've been drawing every day. These are the types of things I've been studying, and I can recommend some stuff. I can't guarantee that I know a solution, but I can take a shot at it. I'm more than willing to try. Okay, this has been going on a long time. I don't need to draw this whole thing. What I'm getting at here is edges, right? That's kind of what I'm working my way up to. Is right now, like I was saying, we kind of feel like we have the same edge everywhere. So first we had the problem of the big shape of the head. We kind of adjusted that, right? So it feels like we're looking up at him a little bit more. And the way I did that, if you notice, was I took that cranial mass shape and tilted it, right? And then kind of built off of that tilted cranial mass. And that kind of gives it that look of like we're looking up at a head, or his head's tilted back or whatever. And then we can kind of find where the side plane sits. And I'm going to skip ahead and just start mapping. I'm not going to draw everything, but we want edge variation is what we're looking for here, right? So we're going to find some softness. Usually, if we're dealing with form shadows, I would say error on the side of being too soft rather than being too hard. But that's just my opinion, and part of that, I think, is personal preference, for sure. Because the other thing you need is just variation, right? Like variation in your line work. Even if you don't see it in the reference, sometimes you have to just add it in. You know, like it's not always, the reference isn't always perfect for a drawing. You know, part of drawing is learning the rules of drawing and learning that photos and drawings actually work very differently. You know, and so we have to actually use the photo as reference, but then change it in ways that will help the drawing succeed as a drawing, right? And follow drawing rules. Because we're following drawing rules and we're not actually following photo rules, right? Photo rules are different from drawing rules.
The person alone who
Yeah.
asked that question previously said
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, just shoot me an email and let me know what you were doing, and I will, you know, I'll try to come up with a solution. Can't guarantee one, but. Okay, so you can see what we're doing, right? We're pushing this a lot softer than what we have over here. Because the brow, yeah, the brow bone is rounded, but it turns really quickly, right? Like it's more like this kind of a turn. Where here we're seeing more closer, maybe somewhere in between these two, right? In terms of how fast that form is turning. You know, and then of course it kind of drops down a little bit. Pops out a little bit here. And then we're going to get this harder edge kind of up under here. I'm not going to bother to draw in the eye, but it basically cuts over the tear duct along that bottom lid, right? Pick up a little bit of the thickness of the bottom lid here.
I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah.
In regards to what you're drawing, unless you already said this, so correct me if you already said it. But when you're working in this way where you just have a little bit laid in and then you go straight to shadow mapping, so
Yeah.
you're kind of speeding up a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there anything in particular that you're looking for as a starting point on the head? Like where on the shadow mapping you would decide to start when you look at this pose? Or is it kind of just based on feel?
It's based on feel, but I'm usually looking for like, I don't know, I'm trying to think. I would pick something really concrete. Like this stuff out here is really soft and a little bit like amorphous. To me, like identifying where the glabella sits right in here is pretty easy. So like I'll tend to start there, but I don't know if there's a real reason for that. Other than it's just like a really, really clear shape. You know, same thing with the nose. Sometimes I'll start with the nose, like because the nose shadow is usually like a really clear shape, has a really clear cast shadow. And so I'll usually start with one of those two things. But I don't know if there's like a real reason why other than just personal preference.
Is it kind of like you're finding something that can be sort of built, like you're building out from there, so that's almost like an anchor point that's really concrete, as you're saying, like
definitely.
Construction-wise, and then you can kind of relate everything else that's a little more subjective back to that.
Yeah, and once you get one section locked in, then yeah, like you're saying, everything relates back to that. Kind of, you know, and then you adjust everything according to that. And assuming your general lay-in was relatively close, it should work out pretty well. I remember reading the Richard Schmid I think, that painting book.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I remember him talking about drawing, and he was like, he just says something like, drawing's really easy. You just draw one thing, and you draw it perfectly,
Right. Yeah,
and then you draw the thing next to that perfectly in relation to the thing that you drew, and then you draw the thing next to that perfectly in relation to the thing you just drew before that, and you just keep going, and then pretty soon you've got the whole thing. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it's so easy.
Yeah,
Just do it.
yeah, basically, yeah, that's the way that he draws. But it's kind of similar, right? Like once we get one little piece locked in, and assuming my lay-in is reasonably correct, then we should be able to kind of piece it together after that.
That makes sense. Cool.
It wasn't until I got more advanced that I realized he was right. As a student, when I read that, I was like, what? That's how he teaches to draw? You just draw everything perfectly. And then I got better, and I was like, oh, actually, that is kind of how you draw.
I mean, there's a logic behind that, but it's
Yeah.
a little...
It's just a funny way to explain it. I think he had a sense of humor about it. Right, so notice, even this nose, right? Like I'm trying to push more variation. Like you have a little bit of a thicker line here, but then you just kind of have this like little thin line. And then a little bit thicker line. I would be really careful with that, right? We're describing something really specific. And you're right, it's going to be thinner, or not even necessarily thinner, but less soft in this area. And then a little softer out here where it's a little bit more round, right? Because it's rounder around the tip of the nose. And then it's rounder kind of back in this area. So it gets a little softer again. And then we have an area in here where it's a little bit less soft. But it just needs to be described really carefully, right? And then we get that little cast shadow that's going to start as like a hard edge, and then it's going to kind of soften up as it moves away. Same thing here. We're going to get a bit of this popping up. And then this shadow is also on the beard, so that's going to cause it to be really soft as well. Right? It's going to get like really soft down here. You know, so just be really careful, right? Like we just want to push that edge variation. I mean, obviously you could push it too far. I don't want to make it sound like you can't screw it up by pushing farther and farther. You can eventually, but usually people need to push it farther, at least in my experience from what I've seen. The tendency is to not go far enough.
Celsius says, Step 1, draw the basic shapes. Step 2, draw everything else.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
It reminds me of those drawing tutorials from when you were a kid where it was like...
Yeah.
It was exactly that.
Yeah.
Like it's a polar bear, so you draw like a circle and then
Yep.
another circle, and then step 2 is like a finished
Yeah,
drawing
and
of
you're
the
like,
polar bear.
what? How is that supposed to work? And then eventually you practice drawing, and then eventually you're like, oh, actually, it kind of does work that
I
way.
can kind of do that now.
Yeah. You know, so then, okay, we've got the beard. I don't want to draw the whole beard and stuff right now. But you can see what I'm getting at, just in terms of edge variation, right? Like this shadow, as it comes down on the cheek, is going to be our softest shadow on the whole thing. So kind of like when you're dealing with value, right? You want to establish a value range, right? So you want to have like you want to establish what your lightest value is and what your darkest value is. And maybe you'll have the darkest value like in the eye or up in this area or something. You know, your lightest value is probably going to be the highlight like up on the forehead. You want to do the same thing with edge. We're establishing a range of edge that tells the viewer what they're seeing, right? And kind of what everything means and what to expect. And so if we don't have at least one really soft edge somewhere, it's going to kind of like change the whole image, you know, and it limits our range of edge. So when somebody looks at it, it looks more like an angular person, you know, as instead, if we come in here and we say, okay, this is going to be like a really soft edge right in here. We need to like really push this softness. right? That really starts kind of changing the whole drawing. Because now all of a sudden that expands our range of edge that we have available to us. You know, and suddenly we can, you know, the viewer looks and says, oh, there's a huge difference between what's going on here and what's going on here. Two completely different things, right? Whereas here, yeah, they're different, but like, even though these lines are thick, this line right here, if you zoom in and look at it, if we were to fill this in, it would fill in right up to that line and you would actually have a hard edge right here. This is actually a hard edge. Even though it's a thick line, it's a thick line that has a hard edge. So if we fill this all in and we turn it into a nice solid 2-value drawing, you actually have a hard edge right there, right? And that's not what we want. So we want to really push and exaggerate those edges, especially when we're mapping, because then what happens is when we fill it in, we lose a lot of the softness, right? And so we'll have to go back and like adjust things and change things, and I don't know, it's kind of a pain, but it's the way it works. This wasn't a good mustache shape. Just come down a little bit. Anyway, this is the end. I think we've reached the end. We've only been doing this for like 3 hours now.
Hey, it's been a good stream.
Good.
This has been a good one. But mouse awaits.
Oh yeah, we gotta go hang out with the mouse.
Yeah, I can hear it
Gotta
struggling.
go deal with it. Yeah, it's probably not having a good time. I would guess they don't like being in traps.
No, I put like a towel over the trap so that it doesn't feel exposed.
That's good.
But it still does not like it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't either. I also do not like being in traps. It's got a really big jaw. It kind of flares out a little bit back here. Then turns into beard. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop. That is my explanation of edge. And just keep in mind, when you fill things in, you're going to lose a lot of that softness, and you'll probably have to go back and adjust it and reestablish it a little bit. But that's pretty much the end, unless there's another question or something. But
No, I don't think so.
okay, we have reached the end. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time.